what I'm going to talk about today is the title of the talk is The Future of Synthesis Under Expressive Control. And I should say, hey, Linn. I should say, first of all, I should say that after I wrote this, I sent it in, I thought, wait a minute, when I go to conferences, I'll never attend a conference type session that starts with the future of, because you know the guy has no idea what the future is. And so I fell trap to that one. And I don't know if I'm the same thing profound, but rather just make some comments. And as in yesterday, I really enjoyed how it was more of a discussion than a lecture, and so I'd like you all to participate. So I have a few observations. I see a lot of synths these days that are more evolutionary than revolutionary. I see lots of synths that have, 3,700 oscillators and 5,700 filters and 10,000 LFOs and 20,000 envelopes and every effect. And then all the presets are ones that you couldn't play a melody on if you're like dependent upon it, because they're, you press one key and it goes like, and I just find those completely useless. And the sad part about it is that with all that going on, all the presets to my ears sound pretty much the same. They're all kind of buzzy. There's a lot of sawtooth and pulse waveforms and some deviation from that. But it's not that useful. They sound kind of buzzy, and most of the presets are focused either for people not doing music, but as I talked about yesterday, more for sound effects enthusiasts or sound enthusiasts, and so I find them fairly useless. And what I look for, if I go through the presets on a synth, I say, which one of these has the potential to be the modern day equivalent of the violin? Or the saxophone, or the guitar, and I find almost nothing that I think can do that. And I'm going to keep going back and having this thing trying to recognize my face as it turns off every few seconds. It didn't recognize, it's because it sees my bleary eyes, it doesn't recognize.
You're a changed person.
Yeah, it's true, yeah. And the other thing that I find is there's not a whole lot of design. It's just throwing everything into the synth. And what I mean by design is presumably somewhere out there are people that buy these things called musicians who want to play music. And I think so many people have been, and certainly me, have been dragged kicking and screaming into the world of having to be an engineer instead of a musician. And musicians, if you're looking for a sound, you say, can you give me something a little brighter? Can you give me something a little more edgy? Can you give me something kind of like a violin but sounds a little bit like this synth or something like that? And what I get instead are lots of controls that are engineering controls. And I understand the problem. It's difficult. But a lot of engineering-based controls, a lot of math, and you get modules now, like the Eurorack module maths, which is phenomenal. It's a beautiful Eurorack module, but there's all these terms in musical products are all about engineering. Led from Germany, we have a popular doll called Logic. Why not Passion or Reason? Right, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So, and then the problem I see is that there's a lot of controls that are not musically goal-oriented. So, for example, FM makes some wonderful tones, but maybe 0.1% of control combinations are actually musical. The rest of them just don't work. And so I don't want controls that allow me to break the sound generator. I want controls that always give me musically useful timbres, Oh, damn thing. There's probably a setting in here someplace. But yeah, and the other thing too is of course, all these synths are made for playing music with MIDI keyboard on-off switches. So essentially, they're all piano-type sounds, plucked strings from the sounds that start, and then they do all their thing with envelope generators. And you know, personally, I don't use envelope generators or LFOs anymore, as I'm sure few of you do. There are cases where they're useful for expressive control, but not much. And so, one thing I will say is that, of course, Eagan Matrix is a breath of fresh air. Now, I haven't really used it extensively yet. I've read up on it, and I play with it a little bit, and I hope to spend more time with it. So a lot of what I'm saying is reaching to convert it, because I know you're all used to what I think is the future of synthesis. Yes.
But actually, the Eagan Matrix is funny because some people are sort of apologetic that they aren't learning it and that they're just playing their continuum instead. So that's great. The thing about the Eagan Matrix is that it is the epitome of math, and almost every combination of things you can do in it does nothing useful. And so it really is more of an instrument builder's tool. And the idea that we had, I don't know how well it's working, is that we would have a couple of... What's that? Yeah.
You should start like that in your website.
Well, no, we do though, because no, the website, actually, if you read the manual, you know, like random patching and all these kinds of ideas that are popular, absolutely make no sense with it. And what no matter what you say, people don't get that. So the idea of the Eagan Matrix is we have these barrels where the person who designs the sound, who's supposed to be one of the 0.5% of people that actually mess with that, sets up some barrels so that you have some reasonable controls, as you say, where the range of the barrels tends to be something useful. But even there, we constantly get the comment, even from very experienced Eagan Matrix users, oh, it'd be nice if we had 25 barrels. And don't get this idea, don't get this idea that, well, actually the idea of the barrels is that you distill it down to, you know, a couple of dimensions of control, you know, between 1 and 6.
The barrels are like the meta controls on top?
No, they're just things that you can use in formulas. So,
but it is a meta control. Like it's basically this structure that you predefine what your scaling range and offsets are for, you know, influencing a number of things.
And then you can, and just like your fingers, you can scale and offset them different ways and put them through, you know, all sorts of different functions and all that kind of stuff. So they can affect the sound in quite a complicated way. But the idea is that people do it. And yeah, it's not very common that people, like I'm surprised, like in the very first sounds we did, which had barrels and were hard-coded sounds, there's a thing called a timbre morph or something. And all the interesting things that people have done in there weren't just the obvious timbre morph where you can tell what they came from. Those are deadly boring. But if you do all the things wrong with the barrels and like make the sound much brighter when you play quiet and much louder when you, much mellower when you play louder, so all of a sudden you get some pretty neat things out there. And other than Ed himself, I don't think anybody ever went there. Not a single user. You know, so I don't know. You know, it seems to me we're sort of divided into the group of people that will play the preset the way it is, maybe move a pedal, and the people that want to really get into all the math and do all the stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's a bad division because, you know, if you look at acoustic instruments, like people mess around with what rosin do they use, or what, you know, or what kind of horsehair, you know, who do they buy their horsehair from, or what kind of bow do they like for different kinds of pieces and stuff, and that's sort of what the barrels are supposed to be. But it isn't. It ain't happening. So anyway, so yeah.
Well, let me say first of all that probably the best way to say this is last night at Sally's house, I was sitting talking to somebody, and all of a sudden I heard this extraordinary kind of a Fender Telecaster sound. And it was Christoph playing with his one-man band apparatus.
His busking apparatus. Busking. He's a busking.
Yeah, busking, exactly. And you know, I was talking about how I play all these new things, and they all sound buzzy and boring. And I just get jaded with all these sounds. Well, I was in a conversation, I heard this sound, and I couldn't believe it. And immediately I had to run over. And you remember I said to you, I said, yeah, I saw an iPad, this has to be a sample, right? And he said, no. And this is once again extraordinary, because there was, when I say buzzy, I'm talking about just a whole range of even harmonics or an even distribution of harmonics in the upper registers. But this thing had character. It was just beautiful. And I was talking to him, I said, how does it work? And at first he tried to sort of give me a metaphor, and I said, no, what's in it?
But see, you're doing exactly that thing, right? Where diving to the bottom rather than the controls. It all makes sense, you know. Yeah, and it's interesting though, because right now we seem to have the people that are really interested, and then the people that don't mess with it. And it'd be really nice to grow that mid-range. And I think part of it is our own fault, right? You know, we need better barrel control over some of the sounds. We need this and that.
Sure,
Yeah.
but I had to play that sound. Because I don't know the meaning very well, but I was trying my best. But it was so good, I had to play the sound. And particularly through your speaker, because it gave those acoustic resonances. But immediately, even with my bad ears, it was apparent that this was very different from all those buzzy sounds, and it was just extraordinary. And so that's a great example. And just that sort of encapsulated sound would generate. That is one of those things where I said this could be a modern day violin or guitar or something, you know, because it actually had things that were outside of a sample or of a Telecaster, Stratocaster sound, and you could do things with. So I thought it was just marvelous.
You know, for me, this is exactly what you were talking about, or what came to mind when you were talking about how a musician would express things, and that's really what we're missing, even in terms of like the barrel controls, is a way for people to say, here's the obvious thing for brighter, or here's the obvious way for shiny, or these sorts of things that you would use to describe a sound as a non-technical person. And if you could do that, people will tweak presets because they know they want it buzzier or brighter or that. And
It's
as
so
soon as
complicated. You know, I'm just thinking about that, and I've had a situation where when people approach the Continuum, one of the things that they want to do, a big complaint when they first play it is that it is hard to control and the dynamic range is too big. And so what they really want to do is, you know, compress that amount of expression just because it's hard to tame it.
Yeah.
And so my sort of attitude with that is like, the first thing you need to do is, you know, you don't give the instrument a chance. You don't give yourself a chance to learn the instrument, and that's really and then the other thing to do is, well, just run it through a compressor like you would any sort of, you know, device that you're trying to tame. And it's really hard from a sound design aspect to do that, because every time that I've gone through and tried to put these, you know, meta layers of control that actually are affecting, you know, like half a dozen parameters, it's going to sacrifice someplace. You know, the math is so complicated.
You know what really helps is Christoph's speaker, or a resonator. I'm sorry, resonator. Because you do get this. You do get this. You know, like Christoph was complaining. We have all these safeties in there because when you're using speakers and you're doing what Rob said. Rob is here. I know I saw him get up this morning. Maybe he isn't. I don't know. Anyway,
No, Rob's still at the house. I made him go back and pick up something.
Oh, okay, good. Because he really did try. He has a hard time this morning. But in any case, he was talking about, you know, on the Continuum, it's really important to crank your speakers and play as quietly as possible all the time. Problem is, from my point of view, because it's my fault, or at least somewhat my fault, when algorithms explode, then it's very painful. And Ed has even told me things like, you know, he just turns it off. He just got so turned off in the harp sound. In particular, we had the harp spiral, as he called it, where it gets louder so fast that you cannot hit the volume, cut volume thing fast. So anyway, so we built in these safeties. We try to notice, and then Christoph complains about, well, I hear these puffs every once in a while. I don't want that stuff. You know, so he turns all that stuff off. But one of the things is he's playing it through a system that has that safety in a much better way. You know, I mean, it's far superior to what I was doing, because what I try to do is like, well, there's too much energy built up in the physical model, you know, try to spread it out somehow and get rid of it. And it makes a puffy noise because hey, it's got to do something. But anyway, the dynamic range is a huge problem, and it's sort of unclear to know what to do with it, other than the only real good solution I've seen is Christoph's, where you have a resonator that just can't do it and does something reasonable. It's kind of like in the good old tube days, you know, if you overdrive the tube, something reasonable happens, and it's not like a transistor where it's just awful.
Well, we've struggled with that a lot in the Djembe app, because you can wire the effects processors however you want with feedback.
Yep.
And it was a lovely thing until I gave it to the first user, And we had to put in a whole bunch of safety features because you hit the death spiral.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few thoughts that have come to mind that I've gathered over the years that I would like to see in the future of synthesizers to make it more catering to musicians' terms and thoughts, and more goal-oriented, musical goal-oriented. And one of them was back at the Breakfast Club that you attended years ago. Dave Wessel was talking about a paper he had written about the idea of just morphing between existing sounds. And the idea that you just have a little rectangle there, and you put violin over here, or you put that wonderful guitar sound over here, and you put a buzzy sound over here, and then you take your result object and move it around between them and be able to choose them. Because it's very, very difficult to create from scratch an extraordinary sound that has that richness and complexity. And Christoph, I think, was telling me that how that was done is you did an analysis. It was an analysis resynthesis thing of a guitar sound. And it used something like 64 resonant biquads to be able to get that. So you couldn't do that. There's no way you could do it by adjusting the frequency of each one. It has to be some sort of resynthesis. So I think that's a good idea. And whether it's just the timbre itself or if it's the entire sound, who knows, it sort of has to evolve. I like the idea if you could have timbres within synth sounds and then be encapsulated responsive timbres. So the timbre itself is responsive to pressure, to however you want it to be responsive, so it responds naturally. And and some people say to me, well, that's in synths, that doesn't matter as much, if they're playing from a keyboard or something like that. But I think it does. I think that even when people create sounds, they want it to respond dynamically. So if you play louder, it sounds something like brighter, or in some way mimics real world sounds that we're all used to. Another thing that was so important is the thing you were talking about yesterday, and I talked about the idea of responding at much faster rates at the initial attack of a sound. And it doesn't really tax your synthesizer that much because it's such a short period right at the beginning, and it's only Z, it's not X or Y. Another thing too is although envelopes are I find them useless. I don't use them anymore. I've got 3 right here. I've got 3 LFOs over here. Actually, probably more. But there are times when it can be useful to have envelope control. For example, if the sound source is not a resonator and doesn't have, for example, a decay on a pluck sound, or perhaps you want to be able to have a sharper attack than you could by playing it on a soft surface like this, especially maybe. And so I was thinking it'd be nice to have, instead of envelope generators, in some cases it would be good to have envelope modifiers. And I forgot if I talked to somebody, maybe I talked about part of the talk, I'm not sure. But at any rate, the idea is just something akin to a simple rise time or slew rate for both rise and fall. So for example, if you wanted to have a sharp attack and then let it decay down slowly, you just have a slew that you can put on the fall time. But the other thing for rise as well, there are cases where you want to play something and you want to have a softer attack and you can't quite play it yet. And my first reaction would be, learn how to play it, buddy. But at the same time, it is helpful sometimes to always have a softer attack on the sound. And the other thing is the opposite too. Sometimes if you want to play it and you want to get a sharp attack, you can't get it enough if you have a responsive pressure surface. It's difficult to do anyway. And so you could actually have an attack slew knob that if you put it all the way to the left, it accelerates. And a way to do that is you just multiply the incoming pressure levels so that it comes up much faster and somehow tops out at a certain point that wouldn't work in all cases, but it could be useful anyway. And so
those ideas are heavily used by Ed.
Oh, is that already in it?
Yeah, there's another trick that I do with the system is that you do things in the background. So you can essentially preload energy into a loop without hearing it. So depending on where you're playing, and this really that comes to when you play with the attack envelope. If you strike something, and then sometimes you can strike it and then immediately come off and then come back in again. And so because we have so many different parameters, and this is I can't remember exactly which sound, but I know I've done this in the Y direction, which is not very. It doesn't have nearly the resolution that we have in the X and the Z direction, but it's still very useful for these very big things where you can change those energy. But it's all about getting that energy and then playing with it after.
I think I'm gonna have to get one of these things. It's marvelous. Yeah, this is great. Obviously, the things I'm thinking about here are things that you've thought through very deeply.
Well, yeah, we live in a similar world.
What's that?
We live in a similar world.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. It's just you got to that world first.
Your emissaries from the future.
Yeah. But the other thing too, and this has to do with ease of use, design, and it's hard to design it. And first of all, I think from what I've seen first on Eagan Matrix, it's just extraordinary that it exists and that it meets the needs, and people have learned to use it. And at the same time, in general, for instance, I would like to see controls that are more focused on what a musician would say to a musician to give me this sort of sound. Controls, and the ones that come to mind are just brightness, darkness, thinness, fullness, however it's defined in that particular encapsulated timbre. Constant dissonance. You want it to stretch out a little bit, maybe get a little bit of a harsher character. Simple, complex. Something that has a useful alteration of a body character, for example. Soft, harsh, clean, overdriven, all these sorts of things that if you listen to musicians talking about musicians, they use, but it's hard to do that, and you want to make sure that those controls don't break the sound generator, but they all internally have some sort of limits that when you do combinations of things, you can't break it. And it's a very difficult task, but this is the design that I see being ignored by at least everybody else in the synthesis development community. And I did a talk at Morgan's Audio Development Conference a couple of years ago about this very thing. I don't know if everybody got it. I doubt it.
Oh no, that's too bad.
But in the in the Eagan Matrix, I don't mean to overstate what we got.
Oh,
we have the idea, but the actual, like Ed says, the actual, it's hard enough to make a really good sound. Most of our best sounds are actually difficult to play. It takes quite a while to learn the finger control and stuff with it, and then to do this is very hard. Just the the one-dimensional change of, hey, you got a continue mini instead of a continuum, and you got the limitations of what the continue mini can do. We have a whole separate library, a different copy of every sound that just deals with that immediate problem. And yeah, as you say, it's very hard. And I think what people don't realize is that if you really want to do an Eagan Matrix design on that level, it's definitely possible, but it's like making a new acoustic instrument. I mean, you're going to spend a year or two at it. Yeah. At a single one. And people always want to, oh, well, how many sounds do you have? And it's like, well, that's really the wrong question. I really think that's true. I actually, even though Ed might disagree, I suspect if you picked any of our, any of your favorite sounds, you could put all those controls in, and it would take you a year to do it.
It's very difficult.
Yes.
Yes.
As we're doing this for love and not money, and it's really difficult to feed a family.
But it's out there, and I'm hoping that eventually somebody will pick up on it. We'll at least have a few sounds like that. But the dream would be, like you say, to have the whole library have a set of fundamental controls like that.
Yeah.
And put them under or whatever you want. If you want to change the size of your body or whatever it is while you're playing, or if you want cleaner if you want thinner or fuller, or if you want. I'll pretend I didn't understand that. Yes. All those things. But it's like you say, it's extremely hard. And I think one of the things that happens now is that, like brightness. Well, traditionally in synthesizers, that's just a filter.
Yeah.
And that's so boring and so uncomplicated and so oversimplified that it ends up being like a bend wheel for vibrato where it just changes the pitch. It's like, on a violin where you get the bony and the flabby part of your finger touching the string, all sorts of things change when you do a vibrato. And to just wiggle the pitch is like, well, okay, that's just too boring. But I think every one of these things is like that, and it's just very, very hard. So very cool idea. I like it, and it is a future thing. I think once this technology matures, but I don't know if it's our lifetime.
Well, what's interesting about that is I learn math just enough to get results. And at a certain point, I really don't want to understand those. You know, I'm using my ear all the time to do these. And so what you want for the musician is you want to simplify that thing, and you want them to be able to concentrate on using their ear. They really don't want to understand, okay, well, what is the structure doing here, and how would I overall make this darker or brighter? We want those simplified controls to do.
On the same boat as you, I don't really know much math at all. And for example, my Adrenaline guitar pedal, it has 40 guitar amp models. I tuned them all by ear.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know the math.
Yeah.
It was the straightest point.
Well, and actually, it's a big problem now. I think, you know, people talk about these perfect oscillators and all these other things. And, you know, if you look at like what Bob Moog did, I'm absolutely convinced. Yeah, he's a good engineer, but he has a really good ear. And if you look at like his low-pass filter, some of the greatest work he did, he didn't just design that on paper with formulas and decide, okay, this is going to be the best because he predicted that mathematically. No way. You know, it was a
and Bob has said, you know, I've had that conversation with him. It was alive, and he was really honest about it. Yeah. One of my favorite quotes of his is, you know, synthesizers aren't going to replace musicians, because you have to be a musician to make music with a synthesizer.
Although that's absolutely untrue, of course, because you look at any Broadway show and there's, you know, 3 synthesizer players and then 3 live players to cover up the shortcomings of the synthesizers.
But you bring in a really good synthesizer player to be able to do that.
Maybe, but it's replacing 40 musicians.
Well,
one of my favorite quotes from Bob is, "May I have another glass of wine?"
One of my favorite quotes is, you know, he's telling me sometimes, he said, well, you know, every time I say something, I offend people. Maybe I should just not say anything. I'm familiar with that.
Well, let me ask you this. Are there any other synths on the market you're aware of that approach Eagan Matrix in these things that I've talked about?
No, because everybody thinks a modulation matrix is the same thing. They don't understand the difference between taking surfacey controls, and it seems complicated. You know, you got, oh, I have 12 different parameters I can control, but they're much too simple. This interleaved, you know, thing is, now obviously something like Max or Kima or something can do all these things, but they don't actually happen.
That's what I was going to say. Like the whole idea that I had for the Eagan Matrix was born out of 2 things. One of them was my experience with Kima and learning the math in there and the sort of structures that I had to get results. And I was fortunate with Kima is that it had a really a pretty tight relationship with the fingerboard. So it was, the parameters were, all these hot variables were, parameters were locked in already, and so it was easy to get that kind of, not easy, but it was available to get that kind of control interaction between the continuum and the Kima system. But the other thing that was really fundamental in the design was the limitation of what the shark could do. And so when we kept everything inside that shark, we kept it as a closed society, you know, you just forgo this idea of, well, we're going to have tons of RAM. You know, we're just not going to have all that access. And we're gonna, but all those, it just made the thing so super fast. And so, and since he's so good at optimizing, I mean, and he kept it inside this world, that world was then defined, and so it had very, very discrete borders. But within there, it was a wonderful thing to discover. And I think that's actually a big problem in general, that people are always looking for the next thing, and computers are always improving, and they just don't dedicate themselves to, you know, like even something as relatively simple as a mini mode, you know, where you could, if you really explore it, people still explore it. And
well, and I'm not, you know, a Kima representative. I don't work for the company or anything. But one of the sad things I hear about Kima is that, oh, well, their hardware is several, you know, it is whatever, N years old now. And I just want, you know, I just want to say, look, how much of that world has been explored? And it's got to be like 1/10%. And that's what I told Ed too, because early on it was frustrating for him. You know, there's many things you can do in Kima, which is a much bigger system and than the Eagan Matrix and much more general purpose. And I just told him, look, you know, we're in a tiny corner of this unexplored planet. You know, and do you really need to go to 10 other planets? You know, why don't we explore this planet? Because it's an amazing place. And so there's a lot of arbitrary limitations. And I also like the arbitrary limitation of the Eagan Matrix. Like, you have a certain number of formulas. It's truly a modular, which means for my optimization, you have to have limits. If you have a general purpose computer, you can't optimize. But you have to have limits. And the Shark is in lots of products. It looks good on a feature list, and it's not that expensive. But you get 100 times performance improvement. And I'm not exaggerating, if you really optimize on it. And that's something that only happens in architecture. It's not a von Neumann architecture. So, you know, but almost nobody does that. Everybody just programs it in C. And, you know, it's like as if you tried to program Microsoft Word on your GPU. You know, it's okay. It would probably run, but, you know, it just wouldn't really use the GPU in a reasonable way. And that's a confusing thing about the Shark is people just don't realize how much power there is there.
Yeah, the only thing it concerns me about the Shark is a lot of analog devices customers are moving away to general purpose CPUs, and it makes it difficult for them to keep up innovation. So it's hard to say, but yeah, actually,
yeah. I mean, the thing with the Shark, you know, the vast majority of signal processing is done on Java on a cell phone, you know, which uses like 1/1,000,000th of your processing power effectively, but it's good enough. You know, all those cool faces we see, and you know that make you look younger and stuff, all that kind of stuff. It's just done, you know, with totally hardware independent. And the thing about the Shark is it's much like GPUs. It is a very different way of programming, and I would say, you know, a tiny percentage of people in the world right now are interested in learning a different architecture. Everybody, you know, and TI's whole approach, they're leaders in DSP. Their whole approach is nobody does, you know. Make the benchmarks look good, have a fast FFT, and to assembly language programming those machines is, I can't say those words here, but it's just a joke. I mean, their instructions are added because their programmer for a particular benchmark wanted some instruction to make that run a little faster. You know, it's just a mess. But it's fine if you only want to program in C. And the Shark is just a different world. You know, there you really, really have to reorganize everything. And people care about, you know, like in computer graphics. In a computer game, if you're in a cave and there's a puddle in front of you and there's water dripping into it, you see the right wavy reflection of the flashlight down the hall of somebody walking towards you. And the sound, boy, they're amazing if they do a head-related transfer function. You know, it's so trivial. There's no ray tracing. There's no anything for the sound. It's just a joke. It's a good recording. And you know, so sound technology is a joke, and video technology is great. And I think that's reflected in the people not bothering to learn the Shark, people not bothering to spend time on it.
I don't like the parable of the cave as interpreted by the Walpocken.
Yeah, no, but in all seriousness, I mean, it's, you know, if you see the greatest new sound stuff, it's just a joke. And so it's funny because actually video stuff is harder, but for whatever reason it's very video centric. It's also interesting because audio is much more important for survival, right? People that go blind live much longer than people that go deaf, and that sort of thing. So it's funny because almost all those games are survival games. But I think we're, you know, the whole industry of video games and then everything is samples.
So you do very interesting audio processing on GPU.
Yeah, and I've
They don't
PhD
tell you
students.
that, but-
Yeah, I have PhD students that have done such things, but it's you know, it's so far away. I mean, basically, no sound engineer knows the specular reflection properties of the wall. You know, where every video engineer knows what different materials, how they reflect and what they do. You know, it's just the knowledge isn't there. You can't even find a book, you know, a Gray's Anatomy that lists those values. They're just
Well, at any rate, I notice I'm over my time. So
well, no, I'm over your time.
No, this is absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the conversation. I very much enjoyed talking to you last night too. It was very nice. But I think the result here is, first of all, I'm preaching to the converted. You people already know a lot of things I'm talking about, and clearly Eagan Matrix. I'm going to talk. I'm going to get a minute. But I think the important point here is we've all in this room thought these sorts of thoughts. And so I think it's our role to go out when you talk to other people who make sense to spread these ideas, and you know, they get them enough. And we know, being makers of products, you get these. You tend to do things based on how many times people tell you something, and probably for the detriment of our income, we tend to listen to the smarter customers. Those ones that really know what they're talking about, because they will predict the future more than others, even though it is often the people who don't know these things that buy the products. But it's you can change the minds of developers by giving them the suggestions, by establishing relationships with them, and by giving them writing a short essay. You know, long as understanding they're only going to read the first 2 sentences, but the rest of it may get read. You know. So anyway, with those thoughts, thank you very much.
I would like to add one more thing here as a challenge, because I know Ed won't do it. This has been recorded, He had that list of parameters. Make the 6 barrels do those parameters on any non-trivial sound.
Yeah.
You know, and really do it.
That's a good point.
And just, you know, because I actually do think it's a year's undertaking, except that, I don't know, what do you think of your waveguide sounds? I mean, it's hard enough just to get them in tune. You know, it's so, you know, it's very difficult, but hey, when in your next free year, do that.
Well, I think that's a really hard problem too, is not only would say a brightness barrel be a specific thing to a particular instrument, but it's, you know, completely nonlinear across the range of that one instrument.
Absolutely. For instance, on a violin, it means blowing nearer the bridge. And we happen to have that in one sound, but we don't have all the other ones in that sound.
Right.
You know, no, it's a real thing. Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point. Basically, what you're doing is crowdsourcing within a very, very helpful and useful community. And so the continuum community, I think, could do a lot of these sorts of things and help out.
Well, and there's going to be some nerd somewhere who will actually have the patience and the mathematical knowledge, because the instrument building it's like a violinist never builds their own violin, and every violin builder can play, but not that well.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, it's the sort of thing where I really do see a difference between the people that are really diving into the Eagan Matrix and the other, but we don't have that real difference yet. It's almost always, and if you're not a performer at all, you don't know how to design well. So you know, it's a real issue. But if we can get to the instrument builder people as a group within our in the continuum community, that would be great.
And on that note, thank you very much.